I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristin Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show, after several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me, and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second.
After all we promised, we'd be cordial.
Hi, everyone. Kristin Walker here with Dr. Lisa Day. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Kristin.
I love this topic. I used to do a lot of shows about this topic, and then I just didn't really need to anymore. And that's part of, that's when you're moving on and you're healing from that time. But it's so interesting to me. Today, we're going to get into, are narcissists born or made? So, Lisa, you picked the topic, so let's get to it.
Yeah. And so it is, we talk about narcissists all the time, and we identify narcissists all the time, probably greater than the 1 to 6% that they say is in our population. But
right.
The reason I wanted to do it is partly because, one, while I don't want to talk about COVID or the pandemic, the reason I want to talk about it is because of what I'm seeing during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, and what I'm seeing is bullies during the pandemic.
Yes.
And I was at a campground with my family on Friday, and everybody and his brother is getting out and socially distancing. So you can only imagine what campgrounds look like. And there was a single lane, and this lovely family in a truck pulling a camper were coming out of the campground right away. And then there was a truck coming in the campground. And the truck coming in the campground, a local person, says, "Yo, Colorado, back up." Well, anybody who pulls a camper knows that backing up in a camper is not an easy thing to do. And anyway, so this little instance, as I'm standing there in this absolutely gorgeous place in the Sawtooth Mountains, seeing the aggression come from local A to Colorado B, it just got me thinking. And I thought, what's happening to us, right?
Right.
What's happening to us? I mean, these people are out enjoying the lake as we're out enjoying the lake, but now they're Colorado versus Idaho. So,
right.
So when I went into this, I thought to myself, you and I talk all the time about narcissists, and obviously you have huge expertise in that area, but it started
lived experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I thought, we talk a lot about being on the receiving end of narcissists. We talk a lot about living with narcissists. We talk about run, not walking from narcissists. And so I haven't spoken in a while about, where it comes from, where we see it, and what can we do, as an intervention. You and I talk a lot about run, don't walk to the nearest exit, right? But when we look at the development of narcissism, and we look at, are they born with it, or are they, do they develop it? I think it's really helpful to differentiate the different contributors to that personality disorder.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, we're talking about when it becomes a personality disorder, not just, everyday narcissism. And I think sometimes as you're going through this healing journey, you're so triggered and you're so traumatized that you literally think everybody is a narcissist for a while.
Oh.
Because people have narcissistic traits. We all do. But people that don't have the personality disorder, those are lessons for us to learn from and evolve from and change our behavior. When it's a personality disorder, if I'm correct, Lisa, those things, it's almost impossible for them to change, and they don't want to.
Well, and we realize that, on a continuum, the magnitude, because I do think we throw narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder around a lot whenever we are on the receiving end of that trait. So when, local truck was being unkind to Colorado truck, that absolutely was a narcissistic trait, that he had the right of way and have the other person back up, but nowhere would we assume that he has a narcissistic personality disorder. So yeah, it's so important to differentiate those. And, and I think most, you and I assume that everybody knows what a narcissistic personality disorder looks like. But I think that it's worth a review, and
Agreed.
What do we have? Yeah.
I would love that, because for a lot of reasons, but I do think we need to, review exactly what it is. And Robert Hare's checklist for this is, was written a long time ago. It definitely, I think, needs to be updated, especially since we have so many great examples of it today that we won't talk about, but
everywhere.
But everywhere. Yeah. So what is the criteria for that?
And I'll speak about it in layman's, but there are a couple of things that are important to think about, especially as we're talking about it here today, is that because we will talk about what it looks like in teens, but technically speaking, we don't diagnose teens. We don't diagnose until someone's at least 18 years old and have roughly demonstrated, an enduring pattern of this behavior for about 5 years. So people can go through challenging times and they can react in a narcissistic fashion, and that's not necessarily going to give them a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. But when we see that enduring pattern of behavior, we're going to see things, the self-centeredness and the self-absorption, the biggie, the one that you and I talk about so often, the complete lack of empathy or concern, for the impact that one's behaviors has on others, and manipulation, exploitation, the need to control others, the need for constant attention, affirmation, praise. One feeling like they're unique, that they're special, that they should be treated special and people should see them as special, sometimes so special that there's not an expert on earth that can help them. Narcissists tend to have, pretty exaggerated fantasies of success and power, and will lie about it, or they'll fabricate stories. And sometimes they're so well fabricated that narcissist actually begins to believe the lie that they're presenting to other people. The huge sense of entitlement, and they deserve what they get from you. And the big one that when I talk about practically for people, is that, while narcissism is based on a platform of tremendous insecurity and low self-esteem, this inflated sense of self is bigger than life, right? They're charming, they're powerful, oftentimes they're incredibly successful. But the dynamic that I always, that tends to jump out first and foremost, and you might be able to speak to this one, is that one, we feel like we're crazy. So when we're with a narcissist, we begin to question ourselves. We begin to feel like we're crazy. But there's a huge need for that control compliant dynamic. So love is defined by the extent to which I can control you and the extent to which you are compliant with that control. And it's a pervasive pattern. It's not, fleeting. It's not because you're trying to get into grad school or you're trying to get that campsite.
People can have narcissistic times. Like, I look at it like, okay, so if you've had, and honestly, and I've said this I've talked about my mother on shows, she was raised by extremely narcissistic people, probably personality disordered. My mother has behaved that way at times in her life, and they've been awful. And I feel like when you've been raised like that, and you've gone through so much trauma, when you go through some kind of big life change, your fallback position when you're scared, tired, all, any kind of very stressful factor, your fallback can be to go back to that behavior big time. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're that way all the time, hopefully. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so much sense. And I think it's so important to realize, so when we talk about the different causes or contributors, the nature cause, the nurture cause, and the fate or circumstances, one thing that we do often see, while narcissists can raise narcissists, not all children, as who are raised, or experience narcissism and their parents grow up to be narcissists. But what we do see is that when one grows up in a narcissistic home, and they themselves are not narcissistic, what they still can have is that internalized, overly harsh, devaluing, perfectionistic internal voice that supports that narcissistic parent's voice. And so even if you're not narcissist, if you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, HALT comes from 12-step work. You can go back to that, that self-beating. And if you are a narcissist and you're working on the path of recovery, absolutely. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, not your best self, we go back to that pattern of behavior that's the most familiar.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And it takes so much work to crawl out of that, especially like what you just said, that inner voice. I mean, your inner voice can be your worst narcissistic parent, meaning it's you talking to you. And that part of you that's talking to you is absolutely narcissistic and hateful and awful. And that's a part of you. And it's continuing to beat you up and do all these things. And sometimes I think when narcissistic, personality disordered people come in, it does not feel like it, but it is a gift that's trying to help you heal what goes on in your head all the time with this narcissistic parent that is one of the voices that you hear to yourself.
And the crazier, or as crazy as that, is that it continues. We talk about in the spiritual world, the sins of generations. Mm-hmm. And I was raised by a magnificent mother, loving, kind, supportive, compassionate. But that mother was raised by a malignantly, pathologically oriented narcissistic mother. And truth be told, confessions of a shrink, my natural mind goes to a dissecting mind. Oh, you screwed that up. What were you doing? You left too early. You got up too late. Why didn't you pick up that? Oh, last week I left a chair on the lake when we were packing up our camp. I realized I left my purple chair there. Immediately, what were you thinking? Why did you leave your chair there? Why didn't you go back and look? That is failure. And you're like, it was a $12 chair, Lisa,
Right. Somebody else might get some great use out of it. Big deal.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And I tell folks, I've been on my healing path for, almost 30 years, and those voices are still there. What therapy gives us is the ability to go, okay, wait a second. That's not my voice. That's Grandma Gigi's voice. And I can just say, you know what? It's easy enough to get a new chair. So I think that being said, when we launch into, what influences or where does this come from? I think that we can bring it down to 3 simple areas, though there are many contributing areas, that contribute. And I call them nature. Nature versus nurture is one that we're always looking at in epidemiology and psychology. And then fate, meaning untoward circumstances. But if you look at that nature quality, which is really genetics, in neurobiology, it's inborn temperament. But it's a slippery slope. So in that example I just give you with my grandmother, are those thoughts that came up in my head mine because of a genetic predisposition, or are they sins of generations? Is it because of I observed that with my mother, my grandmother told my mother, and therefore internalized in myself? But we have to know that there are people where I know that my former husband is certainly struggles with narcissistic personality disorder, and my children did not grow up with him. And yet, during the adolescent development of one of my childs, I saw those qualities. And, like we were talking about earlier, it's qualities don't give diagnoses, but it blew me away. I thought, oh my golly, there's that quality, and that points to the genetic component, of narcissism.
Exactly. So think about this, because I saw this the other day. If I definitely, my biological father was a rageaholic. Like if he stubbed his toe on a chair, he literally would pick up that chair, throw it around, rage, take a knife out of a drawer, stab the chair, cut it. I mean, this is how he behaved. This is what I watched happen. And so I mean,
whoa.
Yeah,
whoa.
Exactly. And I had that rage inside of me for quite some time as a younger kid. And, like if I closed a cabinet, hit my finger, I could take a knife out and stab that cabinet door. I mean, I was just, I'm like 6 years old. This is what I watched happening. But I learned, okay, well, that's not really healthy, lots of therapy, all those things. And so now if something happens to me, it had to do with pain, right? So if you have some kind of pain, so now I know, and thank God it's released. And for years, if I stubbed my toe, or like the other day I was at a park and I slipped and fell in a hole and twisted my ankle, and it was painful. And my first reaction was I just laughed.
Wow.
I laughed and oh my gosh, I'm such a goof. I know there's holes here because there's moles. And I just laughed, right? I noticed this with my ex though, because his father was a rageaholic as well. He slipped and fell at the same park and he immediately became enraged and angry and lashed out at me and using his voice, and are you going to help me? And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't take it personally, but I thought, oh, okay. So
Well,
that's
and
it was interesting to see it, that knee-jerk reaction is to go to anger but you have to work hard to not do that.
well, and the other thing, when we're talking about genetic links, that's affirmation that's not a genetic link in you, but that was more a modeled
Right.
behavior.
Right.
And so when we think about narcissism, the genetic component, sometimes people find it more helpful to think about the kinder emotions. So I say that people are born with different temperaments, and I think, Kristin, you and I have talked about this. Some of us have tremendous emotional empathy, sometimes more than perhaps what we would want.
Right.
But we
Like,
can't
is
look
this really a gift? I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
I mean, when I say I can't hear any discussion of animal cruelty or neglect,
Oh.
I literally can't. I crumble inside. Whereas a person next to me might say, well, Lisa, put your big girl boots on and let's do something about it. The differences in empathy are differences that happen at a genetic level. And just while some of us are very, very, very empathic and are sensitive to the whole spectrum of emotions in other people, narcissists are on the other end of that spectrum, and they don't have that natural innate temperament. They think it's funny when a cat is hit by a car, because look at it, it's got smashed,
Right.
And it really is a genetic difference. In fact, me, I always go to the neuropsychology or the neurology of things, and there are some studies that show, when you look at the gray matter of the brain, and it was a little bit boring, but in narcissists, there's decreased gray matter in the areas that are related to empathy. So there's actually a neuroanatomical difference. And likewise, there are increased activity in the gray matter that's associated with self-absorption. So we know that there is some sort of genetic component.
Fascinating. That makes me think of Dr. Jim Fallon, who wrote a book. He's a psychiatrist and a professor, and he wrote a book after finding out that he did a PET scan and had gone around to people and said, why do people just not like me? I don't understand. I don't care, but I'm just kind of curious. Well, he finds out that and he did some tests. He finds out, oh yeah, he has that missing gray matter. He has all the genetic correlates of a sociopath.
Oh my.
And so he wrote about it. And one of the interesting stories he said was, he'd done many, many things to hurt people. And he found me utterly exhausting just doing an interview because I care. And he's like, so you see, that's the difference. I have to make myself do the niceties with people. You actually enjoy it. It must be so exhausting to be you. That's how they see it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and I liken it to dogs. I mean, you and I, we liken a lot of things to dogs, but a pit bull has a natural tendency for aggression, whereas a Labrador has a natural aggression to lick your face. They're just different temperaments. And I think it's fair to compare a narcissist to a unmanaged aggressive dog. But anyway, so we definitely know that there's a genetic component or an inborn component, or something you come into the world with, which later on I want to talk a little bit about when we see that in friends or family or children, some things that we can do. But the big one that you and I talk the most about, I think, is the nurture component, meaning how one is raised, what they're exposed to, the parenting styles, and or the lack of parenting styles. And, when the child is raised by a narcissist, there's obviously several different outcomes, one of which is narcissism. But, one of the main components in that is the conditional love aspect, that we know that healthy nurturing, what the most important, mom's number one role in when a child is born is the phrase I use is to contain chaos. And I always put my arms out as if I'm holding a child. That my role as a mom is to contain your chaos and to attach to you and to provide safety and security. But when I am the source of your chaos, when I am the source of your lack of safety and security, and when my love for you is conditional on your compliance or your performance, that is the breeding ground in itself, for narcissism.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So are they born or made? Both.
Both, absolutely both. And then there's, the different types of narcissistic parents. We've got the malignant narcissists who they unfortunately they enjoy destroying a child's self-esteem. It's a tug of war, it's a power control, it's a dominance. This is where we see the severe psychological abuse and emotional abuse and competitiveness and shaming and guilting and the manipulative behaviors. And it's outright competition. I'm better than you. Children are to be seen and not heard, and certainly not to disagree. But it's we see that more with the malignant narcissists, whereas oftentimes what we call the highly achieving exhibitionists, if you will, narcissists, are the parents who, I am as good as the performance of my kids, meaning my value is defined by your success. And I know a young man who is a highly competitive skier, highly competitive, comes from a family of highly competitive skiers, unfortunately raised by two narcissistic parents, and rewarded for your success, shamed, condemned, exiled, mocked, ridiculed for your failure. And that child's whole value is based on pleasing the parents or performing in a way that parents can feel proud. And that's their sole purpose for being there. And so again, you can see, if you are on the upside of that and you are the performer, you are the exceller, then you do believe you're God, because I am it. I've got both my parents' approval through my performance. So everything that I do is based on how I'm perceived and who I surround myself with, who think I'm the superstar, the success, the power person. But if you disagree with me, then I don't have the foundation to be able to navigate that. I don't have the sense of self-value that comes with the unconditional love and acceptance. It's very conditional love, and therefore really struggle with any kind of personal acceptance of self.
Have you followed at all the Kanye West, Kim Kardashian things that have been going on?
A little bit.
I because to me, in my non clinical experience, because I'm not a psychologist or even a counselor, but I think of him as absolutely bipolar disorder, of course.
That's what it looks like to me.
But
sure.
I feel like we're talking about a narcissist, someone with narcissistic personality disorder that is also bipolar.
And sadly, that is a very, very common combination. And when you think about bipolar disorder, and it certainly has a genetic link. I mean, we can say you're born with it. It's not made. And unfortunately, with folks who struggle with that severe mental illness, they fail so often from the very beginning. And, I know that my daughter has bipolar disorder. And I know that when she was 9 years old and we began to read and educate ourselves about the neurochemistry, at 9 years old, she took the book and went in her room, didn't want me to read it to her. It was a kid's book. And she came out and she said, and this will make me cry. She said, "Mommy, Jesus didn't give me a bad heart." Meaning at 9 years old, because of the turmoil that she was already experiencing within her own mind with regard to herself, she thought she was a bad person. She thought that she was defective, that she was no good. And so when you see folks with bipolar, they don't have that sense of confidence, that sense of self-value, that sense of security. And so they become very, very fearful. And then the ego kicks in that I need to secure that I'm okay through people around me affirming that I'm okay. And so maybe I'll do it through my performance, or maybe I'll do it through my charm. But if you disagree with me, if you criticize me, or you don't like me, then I'm going to exile you. And so it's a breeding ground for that type of narcissism that grows in the nurture environment. Right. And it's secondary to the third thing that we'll talk about here, fate. That no one is going to sign up and say, "Woohoo, pick me. I'd like to grow up in this world with bipolar disorder." Right. It's a fluke. It's a genetic, it's a neurochemical imbalance. But narcissism is almost a part of the survival skill that is developed. Ideally, we can intervene early enough. As I was saying earlier, I did see these traits with my daughter and quickly learned that how can I not fuel the growth of that? That's not another dynamic she needs in life. And the beautiful thing is that we can intervene. I believe that, I've said before in previous podcasts that narcissists typically don't present to therapy and heal. Narcissists, and I'm speaking of adults, typically present to therapy and get better. And they get better at being narcissists because now they have knowledge and they use it in power. But that's not across the board. But my belief is that in the developing narcissist, when we see those traits, when we see those qualities, whether they come in as a survival mechanism or as a genetic predisposition, we as family, we as friends, we as community, we as therapists and providers, we can do things, and we'll talk about those, that will help, not fuel, okay? That will help detour the continued growth of that trait into a pathological condition.
Wow. Yes, because you already deal with the, when not medicated, and I've just experienced it so many times. I had an attorney that was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I've had several friends with bipolar disorder, and you can see as they're winding into a manic episode, and then comes the I'm Jesus, I'm a direct descendant of God, all these things, I'm going to run for president, whatever it is. And you can see it happening. And, and on medication, when they, if they will go and take it, they realize, oh my gosh, what did I do? They have that remorse for the behavior. And that's the difference with a narcissist saying, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and and hurting people. The remorse gene is missing, I guess, because of that gray matter that isn't there.
Well, and I think we can look at that, a step further. And what we're talking about is the differential diagnosis there being presence of empathy when in a balanced state, the presence of empathy. But at the same time, we have to be careful because narcissists have perfected that, but I call it charm. Right. And I say, run, don't walk from someone who charms you. And we know what charm is because it doesn't feel good. Empathy, when someone's being empathic to our condition, it feels warm, it feels fuzzy. Right. But when someone's charming us, we feel exposed. It feels odd.
Manipulative.
Awkward. Manipulative. Yeah. If charm feels much different than empathy. But and so that that takes us in to the third cause. So we've got the genetic cause, nature. We've got the nurture, certainly the destructive home environments that we can grow up in. But then we have fate, such as we're talking about here with the bipolar, that you come into the world with a neurochemical imbalance, and that can be a breeding ground to the development of narcissistic traits and or disorder to self-preserve. Right. But the other thing that we want to take into consideration is that life often has unintended, catastrophes, and it's not a genetic trait. It's not the family that they grew up in, but what we know in developmental psychology is that the first 3 years of an infant's life are of paramount importance in the development of separateness, the development, a sense of self. And, if a mother is not available for any reason during these years, whether it be that she's, ill, she's been killed, or she died, or she's got postpartum depression, or she's emotionally not there because of a divorce, or even in the case where there's too many children in the family, if a mom is not present in the development of the child during those crucial developmental years, that can be a breeding ground for narcissism, that I don't feel a sense of value, so maybe I perform extra well. I only get attention with the straight A's or the accolades or the sports advances, or I only get attention for significant compliance to doing everything that mom needs me to do to take care of the other siblings. Right. But there's no sense of connection and attachment with self. And so sometimes circumstances can be a contributing factor as well. And so when we look at those, genetic causes, developmental, relational causes, and then fate causes, there isn't just one cause. It's a conglomerate, of situations. And I don't think I've ever seen one simple situation be the sole cause. I think that when I think of the pathological narcissists that I can't even say work with, because they do not typically present to therapy. They typically are the person being dealt with the client, the client's dealing with a narcissist.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that oftentimes there's contributions from all of those areas.
How about, like we were talking in the very beginning, this time right now, people are so highly activated in all the ways that they are. Doesn't matter what their beliefs is, where they fall politically or where they fall, race, whatever, that part doesn't matter. But this level of bullying that's going on, this level of, I've noticed even with people around me that I don't know very well. Let's say there's someone I see every so often at a park, or I see them in my everyday life at a grocery store, or they're a neighbor or whatever, and just do things that they know to be like hey, Colorado, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff. And I wonder if they're really like that, or if it's just this time.
Well, one thing that we do know is that bullies, whom also are very oftentimes narcissists, or narcissists very often consistently bully, we know that behavior is motivated by fear. And we are definitely in a time of uncertainty, and uncertainty fuels this. So we've got fears of insecurity. We feel, we're afraid of being insecure. We're trying to be, there's no bombs dropping off outside my window right now, but our sense of security on all aspects is being threatened. And we're not very confident in the economic future, or our physical health, safety, and security. Or, my college student says, I said, well, why would she go do this at the end of the next summer? And she said, if we're still here,
Right.
So
Right.
that, and then also fear of being exposed. So people who have generally, perhaps there are people who are narcissistic who have been doing a really good job of consciously trying to be kind, or consciously trying to be empathic, like the sociopath you were talking about, or the fellow, that at these times of increased fear, all of the symptoms of narcissism are coming out more. And we don't want people to leave our podcast fearing that they're going to become a narcissist secondary to the pandemic. But I can tell you the pandemic is not bringing out the best in most people.
No.
And
No.
in fear. Yeah. Fear is what fuels that.
And it's over things where people are so activated, they don't even, read something or hear something all the way. They get a little snip of something, and then they make a huge story out of it. And their reaction to it is violent, either verbally or physically or both. And you, the deliverer of, hey, that was, don't let your dog run on my property, or whatever it is that is just normal everyday stuff. And even if you come at them nicely and say, or even this, at Walmart, my partner is obviously disabled. I'm pulled into an area where you can let people out in order to, because they have trouble walking or whatever. And somebody just is so irritated that they have to wait 2 seconds for someone with a cane and who can barely walk to get out of the car. So starting to honk and scream and curse at this happening. And you're just like, what
in the world?
That kind of stuff is going on more and more and more and more. And I understand where it comes from, but it sure isn't fun when you're sitting there going, what?
Well, it's narcissistic behavior, because if we go back to that, the basis of narcissism is an inflated sense of self, i.e. power, to guard a genuine feeling of insecurity, with a huge fear of abandonment and rejection. So at the foundation of narcissism is this tremendous fear of abandonment, rejection, massive insecurity, but it's an inflated sense of self, which is exercised in that power and control, which is that person at Walmart beeping the horn when someone's getting out of a car where they need additional assistance. And so the environment is pulling out, and I'm going to say our narcissistic traits.
Yes.
And I know that when I was looking for that campsite on Friday morning, when everybody, west of the Mississippi is camping in Idaho right now, it seems, and I'm looking, and I found myself there. You had to get in line it was 6 a.m. I know I'm kind of kooky, but it was 6 a.m. and they release sites so that you can get a site. And I really wanted to camp with my kids. And I found myself thinking, well, move on out. I want it, or I'm just going to take my camper there first. And I had to look at myself and laugh. I thought, what in the world?
Yeah.
What is that, Lisa? And I'm like, well, that's your little sense of entitlement that because you live in Idaho, that campsite should be yours. And I thought that's bizarre. Right. So, during these crazy times, we really do want to challenge ourselves with intent and mindfulness to be aware of that and to work against it. Because I had another situation last week. I was dropping something off in a FedEx, one of those little FedEx mailbox, Daily Bob's. And I pulled over next to it rather than parking in a parking spot, because it takes probably 4.5 seconds to jump out and put it in and then jump back in your car. And this woman, and we live in our small town, this woman came up and she just sat on her horn and then opened her window and she had Tourette syndrome. She was uttering profanities. And I say it facetiously. And I was shocked. And so I got in my car and I drove down the alley, which is where I was going, and it goes by a grocery store. And I thought, I hope that I see her, because with intent and mindfulness, I don't want to fuel that. And by the grace of God, I was pulling through the parking lot and there she was. So I put down my window and I gently said in my gentle, angelic voice with intent and mindfulness, because that wasn't what I was feeling on the inside. I said, here in the valley, we don't honk our horns. I said, we love. And I just said that, let it pause for a second. And she looked at me and she said, you're kind. You're so kind. And I said, breathe. She said, have a good day. And I said, you too. And I drove off. And it wasn't my natural response, I assure you. It was that cortisol response. But I left that, and I have goosebumps as I say it, and I don't say it to lift myself up, but I left it because when using those kinds of coping mechanisms in this narcissistic cesspool, if you will, of bringing out the worst in us, if we consciously put it on our radar that we have to be even more active with that, we can do it. And it has an impact, not only on the other person. I drove away from that feeling really good. I said, oh, thank you, Jesus, for fueling that. That was helpful.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Trust me, I have been tested. I was tested with somebody that loves to bring up things that I just don't want to talk about in my neighborhood. They're very racist, and when they see me in a group of people, they just want to start saying things that everybody there's uncomfortable about and
provoke
and provoke. And it feels like gaslighting, because they know I've told them no, but I did that. I didn't say the kind thing, but I just said, I do not want to participate any further in this conversation. Everybody have a good night. I'm out.
I think that's very kind. I think that's very kind.
I wanted to say, I'm going to throat punch you, chick, but I didn't do that.
I'll take my shoe off and hit you in the head. But I think that's kind. I mean, we teach in boundaries that boundaries hurt, but they don't harm. And
Ooh.
And that was a boundary that, no, I'm not interested. I don't respect this conversation. I'm not interested in this conversation. I'm going to remove myself. And maybe you didn't use those words, but that's what your behavior was showing. And that may hurt their feelings, but boundaries may hurt, but they won't harm. Yeah.
Oh, I like that. That needs to be a meme. Boundaries may hurt, but they won't harm. That's very, very true. And have we had to, just even going in a grocery store, nobody where I live, there's a far few that wear a mask and, whatever their belief about that. But I did have somebody come up and start just giving me grief about having a mask on and in my face, breathing on me. He didn't look well. And I was like, okay, I'm a target just because I'm wearing a mask. And I looked at him and I thought a million things went through my head. And at first I'm always like, safety, who knows whether this guy's going to shank me? I have no idea. But I just looked at him and I winked and I said, are you drunk?
Oh,
and he kind of looked startled because I said it in a very kind of flirty way. And he just looked at me and he just laughed and he said, ha, oh, that's funny. And then we were fine. We even waved and said bye-bye as I hightailed it out of that parking lot. Because you just try to do whatever. I don't want to be on your radar because I know it ain't about me. I'm talking my country self here, but it's not about me. It's about whatever anger is going on with them and they want a place to put it. And so, you're there.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to, the cesspool of the making of narcissistic behavior. So the more we can do things like that, the greater the impact we're going to have on all of us navigating this time. One of the things I just want to track back super briefly with, just because I really get excited about this, is that, when we look at, whether narcissists are born or made, it's not a hopeless cause. Now, I think when they're 30, 40, I think a man can be made, a woman can be made, and it's much more resistant to treatment. But I think that, sometimes we're afraid to talk about abnormalities when we see them in developing people. And especially when we see them in children, and this is more specifically to parents, but we also have the ability to do it within our community. And, there are things that we can do. And by nature, children are self-absorbed, and by nature, teens are very egocentric, and that's part of their developmental movement into individualization. And when we begin to see those, pretty blatant symptoms of narcissism, the complete lack of empathy and the definite demonstrating of entitlement, or the pathological self-absorption, or being, obsessed with self-image and self-comparison, lack of a moral compass, when it begins to look off the radar, we do want to put it on our radar to look at. And, for families, I say, if you see, significant qualities outside the normal range for these developmental ages, I definitely encourage people to go to family counseling, family therapy as a family unit, and to begin to look at where do we think these traits are coming from? Is it a genetic trait that we really need to be aware of because it's in our family line and it's likely to emerge? Is it coming from dynamics within the family or within their social community? We want to look at trace the roots of where those narcissistic behaviors are coming from. The big one that I encourage, and sometimes people don't like this, is I say, use the word narcissism and begin to talk about what narcissistic traits look like. Begin to talk about people that may have narcissism, so that those developing teens, not in a shame fashion, not, oh, don't be like Uncle George, but to be able to say, when one doesn't consider the impact of their behaviors on others, they often very much hurt people and find themselves not included in things, not invited back, not being a part of.
And sometimes they're told again and again and again, and the volume of the telling gets louder as somebody's like, okay, you're not paying attention to any social cues. You're willfully ignorant about many of them. Now I'm telling you exactly what's up, and you're blatantly ignoring it. And now here's my lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so, as parents, we have a responsibility to raise our children, right? And so we have a responsibility to guide them. And if we see patterns and we know there's a genetic link, so definitely there was a genetic link in my daughter's life, and I began to see some of those qualities. You want to gently address them to say, you're at a developmental point and you really can continue to have an impact on the behaviors that you want to grow. Do you want to grow empathy? Do you want to grow selfishness? Do you want to grow love, compassion, and connection? And then we reinforce those. And so for parents, let's get our kids into therapy, family therapy. Let's go with them. Let's talk about narcissism. Let's talk about where the roots may be it genetic or be it exposure to bullying at school. Being on the receiving end of bullying oftentimes can grow that as well. We want to point out narcissism in our own behavior or in others. But as a parent, we want to be strong. Sometimes when we have a child who's got those traits, we begin to walk on eggshells and to tiptoe, inadvertently, fueling the narcissism rather than not engaging, with the narcissism. And remember the serenity prayer, right? So when we're growing up with someone, or we have someone in the family who's got those qualities, we really can be triggered by them ourselves and really feel the need to change them. But we want to acknowledge, our powerlessness in that. And then the other things, and I know, we talk about this with our digital media thing, podcast. We know that too much time on TV, too much time with video games, where there's a real ability to grow that power and control over other people, and not enough social media, and not enough face-to-face interaction are things that fuel narcissism. And, right now we're not having as much face-to-face interaction, which is probably one of the things that contributed to the Colorado incident. Right. And so, whether it's nature, nurture, or fate, as a community and as family members, we don't want to blindly watch it grow. We want to boldly move toward it, and under the umbrella of love, be able to guide and hopefully grow the components that will keep it from blooming into a full-blown malignant narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah, I know we're closing the show, but and I'm sure this was horrible, but it sort of worked. My son would do something when he was a little kid where he just is acting out, and he's just, misbehaving, and it's making other people uncomfortable, his behavior. And I would say, can you stop for a second and just look at everybody's face that's around us, and can you see what's going on with them? Because they're really uncomfortable with what you're doing. Does that bother you that all these people feel so uncomfortable? And I mean, how much can a 7-year-old like look around them and see outside of themselves to get that? But I watched that later in life with him when he would explain something at work. Well, these people were doing this and they were really picking on someone. I had to step in and say, this is not okay. Look at how this person is taking. And I was like, oh God, it worked. Hallelujah.
well, what you taught him, Kristin, was huge, is that you taught him self-awareness.
Yes.
And the impact that he has on others. And that's the foundation for empathy and compassion.
Absolutely.
So, huge.
Well, Dr. Lisa Day, thank you. Any last words for our narcissists born or made?
Let's just make sure during this pandemic that we're not made into one.
Yes, exactly. Stop it. I know everybody's tired. We are exhausted. It is extra work to do this, but we have to, not just for other people, but for you to remember who you are, really. All right. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Mental Health News Radio and the Meyer Clinics podcast.
Hi, listeners. I'll make it quick. These are some really cool places that give discounts and other cool things for listeners of Mental Health News Radio Network. If you want to get amazing help with healing from narcissistic abuse, go to healfromanarcissist.com. If you want CBD products that are the best of the best, I use them myself, go to proze.com and use the code mentalhealth20, mentalhealth20. If you want to get daily perk ups that help retrain your brain to think more positively, go to perkupdaily.com. And also, just because this one's fun, snarkycandles.com. I guarantee you'll love them. Snarky with a Y, SNARKY candles.com. And don't forget, if you want to hear all the shows on the network about first responders, you can go to firstrespondermentalhealthnetwork.com, and all of our shows that focus on narcissistic abuse, narcissisticabusehealingnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.
Aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps, or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@mhnrnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial. Sometimes in you I can fight it, but I oppose it.
Good boy.